just see that if you are logged in by using a mobile as well as system, there is a problem. Look at it.
Okay.
You log out from one of the.
Yeah, yes, sir. Actually, I am from one account only, sir, but I don't know why it is happening.
This is that you just log out once and then come back.
Yeah. Let me try it. Let me try it.
Why not? I have stopped sharing anyway, just for time being.
Sir, now it's audible?
Yeah, now it is really better.
Okay.
Earlier there was some issue with your voice, but yes, it's really fantastic now.
And now any disturbances are not coming, no, sir?
No, absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
So,
and sir, warm welcome to our Early College of Engineering, sir.
Thank you, and then keep a very brief introduction, not too much.
Yes.
And then just we will try to spend time. What is the maximum time I have?
Sir, the session starts at 10 o'clock and it's 10 to 11:30.
Sure.
Including question answer sessions.
Sure.
So accordingly, sir, you can plan your presentations.
You just give me, if suppose if I'm crossing my time, and then just cross up.
Definitely, sir. Definitely. Actually, sir, yesterday when I was just reading your CV, you have written that you are associated with Kerry Rose, sir. Actually, sir, I had also an opportunity to meet him in 2018.
Yeah, at Goa.
Yeah, no, actually, sir, I was at Canada in Queen's University. Means I just visited, sir.
Okay.
2018. So at that time, I just got an opportunity to interact with him for some 45 minutes.
Oh, you went to Queen's University?
Yeah, sir. Actually, my elder brother is in Canada. So we were there. So I thought that let me take an opportunity if sir is available and I can meet him.
Sure, yeah. In fact, I was there with him for 3 years.
Okay.
So significant amount of today's presentation is based on the work what I have done there.
Okay.
And then I see what we are doing also here. So it's basically a combination of both.
Oh, very nice.
So I hope the other presentations went well till date.
Yeah, yes, sir, very well, sir. And really, sir, means the topics which have been covered by all the experts. Actually, that is a perfect flow which is being required to highlight on the multiple applications or the multiple aspects of environmental geotechnics, sir.
Yeah, I'm really happy that sir gave the the inaugural lecture.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Then I think they're good, and good to see that a lot of my colleagues from the same lab.
Yes, sir.
So I think it looks like IIT Bombay STP.
Yes. That's correct, sir. That's correct.
Who made this program to happen? Is it by any chance Kannan or?
Yes, sir. I have, it's Kannan also, and actually, sir also knows me since last many years, sir. Multiple times, sir, we have. I have an opportunity to interact with sir.
Yeah.
On various topics and other things. Many times I request sir also that whenever you are in Ahmedabad, please do visit our college. But since last 2 years due to this pandemic, but now I think
your college, even though as a student I heard about this particular place when I was at IIT Bombay.
Yeah.
And then LD College is well known even in those days.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure whether Professor Paresh Shah was there for a short period or not.
No, sir. He was actually associated with first Nirma University. and now he is working as dean with CEPT University.
Yeah, because he was our colleague and contemporary in our PhD program. Anyway, so if you are once you are ready, and then let me know, and then I will share my screen.
Yes, sir, you can share your presentation.
Sure.
Just before you start, let me have a good introduction, sir.
Yeah, I think just to introduce, then I will go for the.
Yes, yes. So good morning to all the participants. Today we are entering toward the fourth day of this STTP. And initially one morning also I had briefed all of you that today once again we are lucky enough that one of the eminent personality in the field of environmental geotechnics, that is Professor Dr. D.N. Arnapalli sir, is with us and is going to brief a presentation on long-term performance of liners in non-hazardous waste disposal facilities. Before the sir takes over this session, let me give the brief introduction. I really consider as a privilege that I got this opportunity to have an introduction of the sir. So Dr. Arnapalli is a faculty member of Civil Engineering Department at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, since December 2008. Before joining IIT Madras, he was Associate Professor R. K. Rio's Research Group at Geoengineering Center, Queen's University, Ontario, Canada, for 3 years. Dr. Arnapalli obtained his master's and doctoral degrees from IIT Bombay under the supervision of Professor Dr. D.N. Singh sir. The major research thrust or the major research interest of Dr. Arnapalli sir are stabilization of geomaterials using biological processes, that is biogeotechnics, design of barrier systems and buffer materials for hazardous waste disposal, geological sequestration of greenhouse gases. Sir authored about more than 80 technical research publications in peer-reviewed national international journals and conferences. Sir is also a technical committee member of the reputed international conferences and an active reviewer of peer-reviewed international journals. Some of its academic recognitions are editorial board member from 2013 to 16 for Environmental Geotechnics Journal ICE publications. Member Technical Committee on Environmental Geotechnics, that is TC215 from International Society of Soil Mechanics and Geotechnical Engineering. Member the Technical Committee on Barriers, International Society for Geosynthetics. Outstanding River Award for Applied Clay Science Journal elsewhere. Best Paper Award for the National Conference on Geoenvironmental Issues and Sustainable Urban Development held at Allahabad in 2014. Best Paper Award at the 4th World Congress for Civil Structural and Environmental Engineering held in Italy in 2019. So he is also a recipient of IGS Award, that is Sri A.G. Dastur Biennial Award 2020 for Best Paper on Ground Improvement. Sir, other research contributions are, sir has developed a state-of-art geoenvironmental engineering research laboratory, the Department of Civil Engineering, IIT Madras, Chennai. This laboratory houses many sophisticated facilities to research the area of geoenvironmental engineering. So, sir, once again, on behalf of Applied Mechanics Department, we are very glad that you accepted our opportunity and have been keen to present your expertise in the field of geoenvironmental engineering. Sir, I once again welcome you, sir.
So, thank you very much, Professor, for your kind words and then introduction. Maybe if you allow me, I will share my screen.
Yes, yes, sir. Please, sir. Please go ahead.
I hope all the participants can see my screen. I'm just flipping 1 or 2 slides. I think it is visible.
Yes, sir. Clearly visible. Clearly visible.
Thank you for your opportunity. And then, in fact, it is really privileged to present as a part of this STP. And then we will just next 1.5 hours, we will try to dwell upon various aspects of the liner design to contain the non-hazardous waste disposal, predominantly the municipal solid waste. However, we do work on the hazardous waste, something like a disposal of radioactive waste. But as a part of this particular lecture, I'm not really covering those aspects. Please bear with me if I'm really going little fast, or maybe sometimes I may tone down the technical content completely and to the level that you may be aware of those aspects what I'm really discussing now. Just for uh, understanding point of view, I'm just going in a very preliminary level. So let us try to see this, and then if you have any questions, or maybe something not really going well, and then just let me know how to really tweak it a little bit. We all know that the rapid industrialization as well as the population growth led to the generation of substantial quantities of both municipal and then industrial solid waste. Even though we generate a lot of liquid waste apart from the solid waste, but however, we are not really focused as a geotechnical engineer, but we will be more interested in the solid waste disposal. The disposal of these waste basically pose a great challenge to the engineers as well as the threat to the geo-environment in general. In my sense, geo-environment is basically comprising of soils, rock, or maybe the subsoil surfaces. So when you are really looking at the disposal practices, what we commonly adopt to dispose the either municipal solid waste or the hazardous waste. If it is a municipal solid waste, and then we may just go for the even the some of the industrial waste, we may just go for the engineering landfills. We call it as a shallow disposal facilities. If it is a hazardous waste, something like radioactive waste and the high level radioactive waste, we may have to really go for the deep geological repository. I think the previous lecture by Dr. Raviranjan Rakesh, you might have come across all these activities clearly. But in this lecture, we will be contained to engineering landfills, particularly the shallow disposal facilities, and how these disposal facilities are really going to perform over a period of time. We will try to see that. If it is not really properly designed and properly lined or properly understood the concepts of liner behavior, we may end up in contaminating the geo-environment, for that matter, maybe the soil or maybe the far field rock, or maybe the groundwater contamination. Given this, what people commonly do is, this is one of the schematic of US EPA, a subtitle D, proposes a double composite liner system to contain the non-hazardous waste. If you look at the various layers in this particular system, we have a waste, and followed by there is a separated geotextile, maybe may not be there in all cases, but the purpose of this particular separated geotextile is to enhance the service life of the leachate collection system, or to prevent the clogging of the leachate collection system. The next layer is a leachate collection system, where it's basically a bed of a gravel, where the perforated pipes are embedded within the bed of a gravel. The main role of the leachate collection system is a primary leachate collection system, which is called as a primary leachate collection pipe. This is a perforated pipe. In order to maintain the leachate head well within the design level, in general, we do not allow anything beyond the height of the leachate collection system. In general, we will talk about around 300 millimeter above the base of the liner. If anything more than that, there are certain consequences we have to really bear with. So that's why we will purposefully limit it here. And followed by, there is a protection geotextile layer. It could be a non-woven geotextile, or maybe sometimes we also use a sand layer. The purpose of this particular protection geotextile layer is to protect the primary composite liner system, which is basically comprising of a geomembrane, high density polyethylene geomembrane, followed by a compacted clay liner of certain thickness, or a geosynthetic clay liner of 10 to 15 mm thick. So if you don't really have this protected geotextile layer, what really happens is the gravel layer is sitting right on the geomembrane, which in turn is subjected to the overburden pressure because of the weight of the waste, and is going to cause the indentation on the geomembrane. At one point of time, the geomembrane may be punctured or indented severely. As a result, the composite liner effect is completely compromised. So we don't want to have that. So the followed by the composite liner system, basically a primary geomembrane plus GCL. The primary objective of these two layers are to act as a perfect advective diffusive barrier. I'm using a typical term, is basically it has to really, if it's an intact geomembrane, we all know that for all polar compounds, the geomembrane is not really going to leak even a single molecules of a polar compound. But however, the geomembranes, since they are made up of polymers, they diffuse the organic contaminants through their surfaces, even though they are intact. So in such case, and then the combination of the geomembrane or the GCl or the geomembrane and compacted clay liner, they behave like a perfect diffuse barrier so that the contaminant impact on the surrounding geo-environment is limited or controlled. We cannot say that it's completely ignored. But then followed by the engineered surface, and then we will have the secondary liner system. The purpose of the secondary liner system is to ensure whether the primary liner is really perfectly working or not. This particular layer is also called as a leak detection system. If any leakage is happening through the primary liner, it will be intercepted at the secondary liner so that it will not really reach the aquifer down below the attenuation layer. So the second, this is kind of a secondary safeguard of this particular system. If you look at the overall performance of this kind of a double composite or maybe the single composite liner system, of course, all other system components also contribute to the overall performance. But however, the long-term performance of the service life of the geomembrane and then the GCl is going to contribute significantly when compared to the others. So as a result, the present lecture we will try to talk about how the service life of a geomembrane is going to change under a given condition, how to really assess the service life of a geomembrane, and then if the service life is compromised, then what would be the impact of the the loss of service life on the surrounding environment. We will be discussing about in a very detailed manner. So before understanding the service life of a geomembrane, let us try to understand how these polymeric geosynthetics are made of. Most of the geosynthetics what we use as a part of the geotechnical and geoenvironmental engineering applications, they are made up of either thermoplastic or the thermoset. Predominantly, we use the thermoplastic polymers. The thermoplastic means they can, when you are heating, they melt, and then upon cooling, they may solidify. But on the other side, if you are really looking at the thermoset plastics, you cannot really repeat the same process. If you are keep on heating and cooling, then during the heating time, they may lead to charring of the polymer. That means that thermoset polymers may subjected to the degradation when you are heating up. So as a result, the polymer structure may get altered over a period of time. So anyway, we are more interested in knowing about the thermoplastic polymers. We may have thousands of polymers, but however, we will be restricted to understand around 4 to 5 different types of polymers. When you are looking at the high density polyethylene geomembrane, and sometimes they may be amorphous, something similar to your geometry X. You also know the terminology called crystalline or semi-crystalline or amorphous. Particular to the polymer science, and what we try to do is, we don't really, the random arrangement of atoms, we can that as a, amorphous material in case of in general sense. But in polymers point of view, you will be talking about regular arrangement of a polymer chains in a small regions. We call it as a crystalline regions, and these are called as a crystalline polymers, or maybe the semi-crystalline or amorphous. If you are looking at the high density polyethylene, the crystallinity is very close to 60 to 50 to 60%. Why we are really talking about crystallinity? Because as the crystallinity increases, you all know that the mechanical performance of a polymer is also going to vary. Sometimes if the crystallinity further increases from the ductile nature of the failure, you may just completely go to the brittle failure. On the other side, from the contaminant perspective point of view, transport point of view, you also lead that if your polymer is becoming too crystalline, it's really good because the diffusion through such kind of polymer is very, very low when compared to the amorphous polymers. Because the diffusion of any organic compound through a polymer predominantly happens to the amorphous regions of the geomembrane, not through the crystalline regions of the geomembrane. So as a result, if the polymer is becoming more crystalline due to the aging or maybe due to the manufacturing process itself, it's really good from the diffusion perspective point of view. But if the crystallinity increases too much, then there is a possibility that you may end up in breaking the polymer due to the stress cracking. The meaning thereby, the entire polymer can become something like a biscuit. You can just simply break it like this. So we don't want to really see that kind of a scenario. So that's why we need to be focused more on the how the crystallinity is really going to change. Now, when you're really looking at the how these polymers are made, because we take a monomer, example, if you take a ethylene molecule, which is called as a monomer, we combine them by joining the individual monomers by using a covalent bonds. When you're trying to add the covalent bonds, and then this is the way that we try to connect it to the next molecule. As a result, the entire polymer will become a high molecular weight material, and then they're having a long chains. The process of joining these monomers from end to end is called as a polymerization. Why I'm really talking about this one is, unless you understand the little bit of a polymer chemistry, even though I'm not really interested in teaching here, but however, we need to really know how the polymerization process is also going to change the service life or maybe the aging of a geomembrane. As I mentioned earlier, most of the polymers used for the manufacturing the geosynthetics, they're the plastic produced out of a polymerization process. Example, if you use a ethylene molecule, you say that polyethylene. If you use a styrene molecule, polystyrene. Ester molecule, polyester. As so on, we have maybe thousands of polymers available in the industry. But however, for making them geosynthetics, majority of the times we may restrict to the 4 to 5 varieties of polymers. Example, polyethylene, polypropylene, polyester, polyamide, which is also called as a nylon. And then we may talk about the EPS, expanded polystyrene. And then I think all these varieties we may really talk about it. But among all the things, if you are really looking at the manufacturing of a geomembrane, or maybe the geotextiles for that matter, we use two predominant polymers. One is a polyethylene and second one is a polypropylene. 95% of the geosynthetics are made up of these two materials, which are called as polyolefins. Polyethylene plus polypropylene called as polyolefins. Now, if you understand the behavior of these two materials from the fundamental point of view, then your job is done. Meaning thereby, depends on the polymer in the polymerization process, what kind of a physical conditions you are really ensuring, organic environment, and what kind of a polymerization technique. There are a wide variety of polymerization techniques in the solution phase, liquid, gas phase polymerization, even high pressure polymerization, low temperature polymerization. All the things leads to the wide variety of polymers, which are quite different in molecular structure, density, crystallinity, morphology. If you are really changing all these properties, eventually your geosynthetic material will have a different physical mechanical properties. Not only the physical and mechanical properties, you do have the endurance property, that are against the resistance against the aggressive chemicals. So in view of this, we have to really understand how the geosynthetics or the geomembrane used in construction of a landfill, how it has been made, we also need to understand to a certain extent. Not only manufacturing process, we also need to understand how the polymer degrade over a period of time. If your polymer, since it is made up of a organic compound, if they are exposed to the strong solvents or aggressive chemicals, they may dissolve or maybe they may deteriorate over a period of time. This particular case may not be the true when you are really handling the municipal solid waste. If at all you are handling the industrial waste where the organic solvents need to contain, you have to be extra careful when you are using a geosynthetic components, because these components also made up of organic molecules, and as a result, when you are interacting with the strong solvents, they may dissolve with no time. Apart from that, you do have the physical aging. The physical aging means you do not really break the covalent bond between the monomers, but however, as a result of the physical aging, is something like your crystallinity is going to change. It is something like, I always give an analogy between the aging of a polymer versus aging of a human being. The physical aging of a human being also starts anywhere in between the 30 to 35 years, but you don't really see substantial change in your body or maybe physical activity till you cross the 50-55 years. This is the process where the crystallinity increases within a polymer. This is really good, the physical aging, in terms of the mechanical properties point of view. The stiffness of the material is going to increase. The strength of the material is going to increase. And then, but sometimes it is also transforming the material failure from the very ductile to the very brittle nature. That's not really good sign, because the polymer may break without giving any kind of a signs of failure. Okay, and then as I mentioned, as crystallinity increases, the diffusion coefficient also going to go down. The contaminant perspective point of view, that is always good. But apart from that, this may happen well within the 10 to 15 years or maybe 20 years of life of a polymer. But later on, the polymer may undergo the chemical degradation by leading the, by breaking the covalent bonds. Among the chemical, degradation process, polymers do swell something like clays. They absorb water and then they swell, which leads to the process called hydrolysis. By the process hydrolysis, polymer also degrade over a period of time. When the polymer exposed to the sunlight, something like a cover liner system on top of a landfill, and then they may also subject to the photodegradation. In order to impede this particular photodegradation, what we do is we add around 2 to 5% of a carbon black in the manufacturing process of a geomembrane. In addition to that, oxidation is one of the main mechanisms by which polymer will degrade. We will be talking about all these processes one by one, and then we will try to see how these processes are related to the service life. And then if the polymer is exposed to the high temperature for a long period of time, the best example is if you are having a landfill where the lot of organic waste you have disposed in the form of a food waste or maybe some other form, then what really happens is the readily biodegradable component in the waste may degrade very slowly, and then over a period of time this degradation process is basically causes a rise in temperature within the landfill. As a result, your geomembrane or maybe the GCL sometimes may be exposed to the high temperature for a prolonged period. Example, in some of the cases where the geomembrane and GCL, the base of the geomembrane, was subjected to the even the groundwater temperature is very close to 10 degree in North American region, where the temperature might have gone up to the even 55 degree. So that means that the polymer is aging under a 55 degree centigrade, no more very close to 10 degree or no more very close to 20 degree. Because of all the things, we also in the process of manufacturing, we also add a lot of additives, a lot of stabilizers, and in order to enhance their manufacturability or in order to enhance their service life. These additives also will get extracted out of the polymer over a period of time. Then this is also causing a possible degradation mechanism. Among all the things, maybe let me try to talk about, even though these two are not really relevant, very much important for us, maybe let me try to see about how the photodegradation do happen. When a geomembrane exposed to the sunlight as a part of the cover liner, it is not supposed to be. Or sometimes what really happens is, even if you construct a basal liner at bottom of a landfill, many times people do not really either cover with the drainage layer, or they do not really place a waste as soon as they construct. Variably, the geomembrane get exposed to a period from 2 months to 2 to 3 months to anywhere in between the 5 to 10 years also. Sometimes the cover liner is not properly covered with a vegetative layer, and this cover liner is most of the times is exposed to the sunlight. When this kind of a prolonged exposure of a geomembrane to the sunlight cause the chain scission, because of a long molecule is basically a long chain will subject it to the chain scission. That means that a big molecule will become a small tokoda pieces, and then sometimes this causes a discoloration. This particular aspect also you might have seen. Example, a Nilkamal chair or maybe any kind of a plastic chair, you throw it in a garden for 2 to 3 years, you will see the plastic might have changed its color. Not only that, you can able to scratch it on the surface of the plastic, you may get it in the form of a powder form. That means that the degradation of the polymer might have taken place completely. Sometimes the surface dust cracking and brittleness is also one of the possible reasons. As a result of all the things, the polymer will lose the physical and mechanical properties when it's subjected to the photodegradation. In order to understand these mechanisms, and people have conducted both field studies as well as laboratory studies. You please note that exposure of a polymer to the field, in a field, you may have to really wait almost prolonged period of time in order to see the noticeable change in the material property. As a result, what people have done is in the field also, they accelerated the method by using a Fresnel, solar concentrators, where the wavelength is not changed, but the intensity has been changed. But sometimes the field and the accelerated and natural testing methodology demand a substantial amount of time, like 10 to 15 years, in order to completely degrade the polymer even under the accelerated testing environment. As a result, we may have to really resort to the laboratory accelerated test, where you will subject the polymer for the higher level of radiation. As a result, by using either Zenon arc weatherometers or the fluorescent lamps, because significant portion of the sunlight, only the UV region is going to cause a degradation. As a result, we use a fluorescent lamps which can emit only the UV radiation, and we can able to really assess the photo degradation. So this is the some of the possible way that how people are really doing in the laboratory, and then you need not really worry about the testing methodology. The Zenon arc weatherometer is one of the sophisticated testing methodology, where you can able to expose the polymer, not only the UV region, you can able to expose the polymer for the entire solar spectrum. Most of the solar spectrum is covered. If you don't have too much of money, and then however you can go for the UV weatherometer, where either you subject the polymer for UVA type, where the wavelength region is in the rate 400 to 315, or the UVB from 280 to 315. So this predominantly degradation happens in these regions. What we do is, after exposing the polymer to these UV or the Zenon arc weatherometers, Zenon arc light, then we will try to see how the material property, for example, a tensile strength, after exposure to the certain time, exposure time, we will measure the percentage fraction of the material property retained. And then if the polymer is retaining more than 80 to 85%, then you will say that, okay, this polymer is really good for photo degradation perspective point of view. But sometimes you may not really see this kind of a scenario. Let us try to go detail, the details of the field weatherometer. This is the place where in Chennai, where we place our polymers on the surface of these racks, and then we will subject them to the exposure, and then we will try to see how it can be, the weathering can be implemented. This particular site, we have a typical all weather, weather parameters measuring devices, and then we have the pyranometer, which can measure the solar intensity, and you have also UV radiometer. But apart from that, when a black polymer, I mean the black geomembrane, if it is exposed to the sunlight, for example, on average, the annual average temperature of Chennai is very close to 35 degrees, but the temperature at which the polymer is subject to aging, because of the black body radiation effect point of view, the temperature may shoot up to around 45 to 55 degrees and above. So that's why we have installed, a black panel temperature in order to measure the precise temperature of the polymer. So if we are unable to really do that kind of a thing, because we may have to really wait for a long period of time, what we can able to do is we can simulate the entire sunlight spectrum or the portion of the sunlight spectrum. If it is a UVA, fluorescent lamp, can able to substantially, produce this kind of a region of the sunlight, and the others we may not able to really do that. Given this, what we have done is we have also purchased the UV weatherometer, where this kind of a fluorescent lamps, they throw the certain radiation of the UV portion. These are the geomembrane coupons were exposed to the UV light. And in addition to that, this particular system, we do have the possibility to subject the membrane for the spraying to simulate the rainwater. So we can able to simulate the rainwater. We can able to control the temperature. Humidity we cannot control, but however, we can able to control the temperature. We can able to simulate the rain effect. We can able to change the intensity. In this particular case, I have really set the intensity very close to 0.89 watts per meter square. So we have the two, radiation measuring sensors, two here, and then the back of the instrument another two. Effectively, this particular setup we can able to place around 24 pieces on either side. Around 48 samples we can able to place. After exposing these materials to the UV light, we can able to really enhance. Recently, we got the Zenon arc weatherometer. This is basically, instead of using a UV light alone, we simulate the more or less the entire solar spectrum by using this kind of a state-of-the-art equipment, and where you can able to spray the facility, and then we can able to control the humidity and temperature. So after subjecting the sample to this kind of environments, then what we do is, at a given exposure time, we'll take out the specimen. We will try to measure the tensile property by cutting the dumbbell shaped specimen. We can also measure some of the chemical properties, including the OIT, oxidative inductive time, and crystallinity. I will tell you what is the meaning of oxidative inductive time. Oxidative inductive time means in the manufacturing process of the geomembrane, oxidation is one of the major mechanisms by which polymer degrade. That means that if we want to really impede that polymer degradation by the oxidation process, we add a lot of antioxidants in the manufacturing process itself. The amount of antioxidant present in the polymer is measured by oxidative inductive time by the DSC, differential scanning calorimeter. This facility we have in our lab, you can able to really do that. Further, because exposure to the sunlight for a prolonged period of time, the polymer becomes subject to the change. That means that the molecular weight of a polymer is also going to go down. So in order to measure the molecular weight, what we do is we try to employ an indirect method called as a melt indexer or the melt flow index. We can able to really measure the polymer molecular weight. Not only the mechanical property and chemical property, we also measure these polymers once they exposed to the certain level of radiation. We measure the diffusion coefficient by using this kind of a cell, which is called for the volatile organic compounds, by using a GC gas chromatograph. So this is what the way you try to assess the photo degradation of a given polymer. So coming back to the mechanical performance of the polymer, even after exposure to the certain amount of this one, you will see that the yield point and the break point didn't really change in case of a polymer. You please note that in case of a UV weather testing equipment or Genanar, your sample is exposed to the one side to this radiation, other side is unexposed. So that means that if you note that the weathering process always starts from the surface, and when you are trying to test the mechanical testing, something like a tensile property, the entire bulk material is going to involve in the process. Meaning thereby, you may not really see the weathering initially by conducting the tensile test. So this is what exactly we have observed. We have seen that the break and yield strength is not really changed too much, but however, even though we expose them even for 20-30,000 hours, but not much significant change in the in terms of the break and other thing. In order to capture the surface level phenomena that initiated on the surface initially, later on it will propagate into the entire polymer. In order to do this, we deploy the nanomechanical indenter test, which is basically something similar to you all aware of a mechanical indentation to measure the hardness or maybe some of the mechanical characteristics of a metal. Similar to that, but only the difference between that equipment and the nanomechanical indenter here, we only deploy a probe which is made up of a diamond, and then this probe having a dimension of in the name of a nanometer level size. That means that you poke using the diamond tip maybe on the surface of the polymer, only you make the depth of indentation in the range of nanometer, maximum micrometer, and then the amount of load applied is also in the range of micronewtons, not more than that. How do we do that? This is the kind of a surface profile of a nano indenter, which is basically this particular technique was proposed by the Oliver and Farr in 1992. So this is the initial surface. After indentation, the surface may get deformed something like this, and then by transforming the depth of indentation versus the amount of the load applied, you can able to really measure some of the mechanical properties of a polymer. So we took the weathered material, whatever we have taken out of the weatherometers, and we did the nano indentation on this kind of a facility. How do we do that? We indent slowly. This is the loading ramp, and then we apply some micronewtons of the load, and then after reaching the Pmax, then what we do is we maintain the load constant in order to capture the viscous behavior of a polymer. If there is no change, then what we do is during the unloading portion, the slope of the curve is going to tell us what is the hardness of the material is. Example, by seeing this particular aspect, then you can get the hardness value, And then by knowing the hardness and other parameters, you can get the reduced modulus during the unloading curve. So that means that by knowing the reduced modulus, we can also back calculate what is the modulus of a polymer. Now, if you can able to, that means that by doing the nano indentation, you are trying to monitor how the hardness and modulus of a polymer is changing at the surface level, a few micrometer level, because this is where the polymer is aging, because the bottom layers may not be subjected to any kind of a photodegradation during the initial period. Of course, at the later dates, the entire polymer may be subjected to the photodegradation. So these are some of the nano indents we made on the small tiny piece of a polymer. The entire around 25 nano indentations we made on this, and then more or less everything is showing same. If you look at the size of the sample, what we need to make the 25 indents is something like a 25 paisa coin, not more than that. So it's a very, very precise measurement what we can able to do. So we plotted the variation of, what is the role of depth of indentation on the hardness as well as modulus. And we saw that when there is something, then ultimately we optimize this particular depth of indentation to further investigate. Now we have noticed that there is a change in the modulus. How do you really collaborate or substantiate the measured change in the hardness or method change in the modulus value? For that matter, what we did is, if at all there is a change in the modulus on the surface level, obviously some molecular level changes might have happened to the polymer on the surface. In order to capture the molecular level changes in terms of their functional groups, what we did is, we have the FTIR, Fourier transform infrared spectrometer. We try to really see how this kind of a absorption spectra is varying as a result of the front phase, which is exposed phase, the red phase, there is no exposure. So then at a one given absorbance value, example around this particular wavelength 1715, if you say the exposed area, this particular absorbance value increasing, that means that something is happening to the polymer at these regions. So why I'm really trying to explain this one is, once they degrade over a period of time, the polymer initially has certain functional groups in their, example polyethylene. The CH functional group is more predominant. Upon degradation, what really happens is the carbonyl group will become more dominant. When carbonyl group is becoming more dominant, that means that aging of polymer is taking place. This is one way that there is a term called carbonyl index. We can use this parameter to capture the degree of aging. So we try to quantify that in terms of the FTIR. Further, we also try to see how the crystallinity of the polymer is going to change once they expose to the photodegradation. Whether the change in crystallinity does it really reflected in terms of the stress crack resistance. There is an apparatus called environmental stress crack resistance apparatus. This is what we fabricated at IIT Madras. Then it's a very simple test, something like a dog bone sample. And these dog bone samples are subject to a certain amount of loading by using the lever system. And then before loading, what we do is we make a purposefully the small tiny cut on a polymer. And then this cut, what we do is we subject to the tensile load, certain degree amount of loading, and then we immerse the entire thing into the detergent solution. As a result, at one point of time, your polymer no more fail by the elongating a long way, but they fail something like a very brittle failure, something like a biscuit. So this also tells you whether the failure of a polymer is going to happen in a ductile way or maybe the more brittle fashion, maybe in terms of the stress crack point of view. Because this is also going to happen in your geomembrane when it is subjected to the high tensile stresses due to the indentation or maybe due to any other process in the landfill also. You may not be able to see the polymer has failed, but however, this phenomena is going to happen. So we measure that the SCR value, if it is anything more than 300, people say that is really good. But however, in our case, it cost even more than 800 in distilled water. But when we dipped into the EG-PAL, which is called as a detergent media, what we have to use, and that really reduced to the drastical value. So the next process, we have talked about the photodegradation process, and then the next process is called as a swelling. I told you very clearly that polymers do swell upon absorption of water. A molecular level absorption of water will take place on the surface, and that leads to the process called hydrolysis. And this process is always very dangerous, particularly in case of a polyesters. When the polyester is really exposed to polyester geotextile we use, wherever you subject this material for the high alkaline or high acidic conditions, then this kind of a phenomena is going to be one of the crucial one. So till now we have talked about swelling, we talked about the photodegradation. Later on we will move to the oxidation. I told you in the starting point itself, in order to retard the oxidation process, we deploy some amount of the antioxidants in the manufacturing process. In order to understand the oxidation phenomenon, let us better to understand by investigating the little bit on the polymeric oxidation cycle very clearly, how it can be done. If you look at in the manufacturing process, even though we are adjoining the monomer in order to make long chains of a polymer, but still the process always left with some amount of the free radicals in the polymer. This is true even in case of human body as well. We do have a free radicals, we also age over a period of time. But however, at one point of time, our cells rate of growth is much higher than the degradation or maybe the depletion rate. As a result, you may not see aging in a human, you may up to 55 or maybe 50. Afterwards, this process will dominate. So the free radicals, what they do is, upon interacting with the free oxygen available in the water, or the dissolved oxygen available in the leachate, and then that end up in producing another aggressive free radical, which is called as a hydroperoxide. And then hydroperoxide radical, when it interacts with the polymer chain, and it will dissociate into hydroperoxide, and then this hydroperoxide will dissociate into again free radical and OH minus. So once this process starts, is something like a cyclic process. This is called as a primary oxidation cycle. This is called as outshoot of that one is called as a secondary oxidation cycle. In order to control these primary and secondary oxidation cycles, what we do is in the manufacturing process, we induce primary antioxidants and we also induce secondary antioxidants. So we can always quantify the polymer oxidation process by measuring the quantity of the antioxidant left in the G membrane at any given point of time. That can be measured by using a oxidative inductive time, OID value. So that means that how the oxidation do happen in case of a landfill. We know that this is the process by which it can happen. But the process, is it same in case of a landfill, or maybe if the membrane is simply immersed into a leachate where the leachate of certain concentration, certain temperature, certain chemical activity, we maintain that. Earlier, most of the oxidation phenomena was studied on a free membranes just dipped into the leachate. But however, if you look into at a given landfill base, your G membrane not only subjected to the chemical leachate, not only subjected to the thermal effects. Because of the thermal effects, because of the decomposition of the waste, the temperature of the basal liner may increase maybe even up to 85 degrees. This is quite possible. 55 is quite common. So that means that your membrane is subjected to the aging because of the physical loading caused by the weight of the waste, and then because of the thermal loading, because of the decomposition of the waste, and chemical loading because of the leachate composition. So that means that you need to really investigate the combined influence of physical, thermal, chemical loading, the synergetic effect you need to really take into account. In addition to that, you do have the indentation within the G membrane because of the granular particle is subjected to the overburden weight of the waste, and this will try to poke the G membrane. And sometimes because of the thermal expansion of the polymer, you do have wrinkles in the G membrane. These wrinkles are called as waves sometimes, even though after placing the waste, the wrinkles are not really going to become flattened. So the reason why I'm really talking about is, once the wrinkle is formed, this is the high stress concentration zone. When the indentation is formed, this is the high stress concentration zone. The meaning thereby, when the material is subject to the certain straining level, when it is exposed to the oxidation cycle, then the degradation is entirely different than the membrane is just simply dipped into the leachate. So as a result, we want to really see this kind of a phenomena. What we did is, as a part of my postdoc at Professor Kerriro's lab, we developed this facility called a geosynthetic liner longevity simulator. It is called as a GLLS. And this facility basically is a pressure vessel, a metallic body, having is almost 0.5 meter or 0.6 meter diameter and 0.5 meter height. The weight of the entire cell may look like, after putting everything together, maybe very close to 1.2 ton, something similar to that. But the beauty of this particular cell is you can able to simulate the entire various proportions or maybe various configurations of your linear system. I can able to simulate a wrinkle. I can able to place the leachate collection system, and we can able to maintain the leachate head well within the zone, and we can able to recirculate the leachate so that the way it is happening in the landfill, we can able to maintain the temperature of the geomembrane of the entire components by using a heating cable here, and afterwards we put a nice insulation jacket, and then the physical loading we can able to apply up to around 1.2 megapascal we could able to apply. So by what we did is, in order to do that, a rubber membrane has been placed. By inflating the rubber membrane, we push the gravel particle downward, and as a result, we can able to measure the level of overburden pressure acting on the membrane. So these are the certain things what we did as a part of this particular work, and this is the GLLS before loading. You see that the membrane is very smooth, and below there is a GCL. In order to seal that one, we have placed the bentonite seal, and these tiny holes 1 and then 2 and 3 and 4 at 45-degree angle more or less, and they are basically leachate recirculation units. After placing that, we will place a rubber membrane here, I mean the bladder, and the bladder will be pushed down by inflating it in the other direction. After testing this particular condition, what we did is the smooth geomembrane, you see that subjected to the severe indentation. Even this particular scenario, when we test the material at 35 degrees centigrade, we applied around 250 kilopascal loading. 250 kilopascal is something similar to around 20 meter height of the base, not more than that. And then we also tested at a temperature of 35 degree, and then only for 2 months, your membrane is severely indented, even though after placing the protection geotextile. So meaning thereby, we want to really see what really happens. For the indentation, because the gravel particle is pushing here, and then the indentation is formed. Suppose we want to really measure the strain below within the geomembrane, how do you capture that? Because if at all I want to if I remove the load, because of the elastic rebound, the geomembrane will go back to the original position, or maybe at least it will rebound significant portion of the strain. In order to capture the in situ strain, what we did is we placed the lead sheet below the geomembrane. This lead sheet, when it is really indenting, the geomembrane will push the lead sheet downward, and these are the indentants. So even after removal of the load, the geomembrane may rebound back, but lead sheet is not really rebounding back. By capturing this particular one into the, we freezed into the plaster of Paris, and by using a line laser, we try to digitize the indentation, and then by using a protocol and one particular technique proposed by the Rowe and other people, and we capture the tensile strain within the geomembrane. If you can notice that the maximum tensile strain in a geomembrane is varying with respect to the temperature. That means that if I test a membrane at 20 degree, I have the maximum tensile strain of 12%, but the same geomembrane, if subjected to the 85 degree, I am having a very close to 22% strain. You may say that 22% strain is nothing in case of a geomembrane. That is true if the membrane is virgin geomembrane. The meaning thereby, the original membrane may be able to fail at around 200 to 300% strain. But once the membrane started easing, even 20% strain is good enough to crack the membrane by the stress cracking. So that is the reason that why we have really investigated this. These are the 50 GLLS may look something like this. These are the one small tiny GLLS. I told you this guy itself is a 1.2 ton, 1.1 to 1.2 ton. Like this, we have tested around 50 of them. And then we have used around 50 worm run controllers, because we want to test wide varieties of temperatures. And then we also monitored these temperatures. Almost every cell, we erected around 8 thermocouples, and these are all 50, around 400 channel data acquisition system we deployed. And then this data acquisition system, fortunately, I can able to monitor even by sitting at home. And then these are the, the temperatures at which I'm really conducting a test. One is 85 degree. I supposed to maintain at 85, but it should go up to 85.4, 82.6, something like that. And we have tested a wide range of configurations and wide range of temperature conditions and leachate recirculation states and wide range of applied pressures. As a result, what we did is, and not only that, after taking out the G membrane, we also measure the YIT by using a DSC. It's a very, very simple test. It's not something very great. If you look at the YIT test, what we do is we increase the temperature of a G membrane at a constant rate till we reach the 200 degree. Unless, up to that point, what we do is we maintain the nitrogen environment. Once we see the constant temperature, we induce the oxygen. So because of the oxidative nature of the oxygen, what we really see is at one particular point, and we will see the oxidative curve. And the time elapsed between the starting of the injection of the oxygen till this point is called as a YIT value. Once you know the YIT, you can able to really say that if the antioxidants are really present, significant, then this YIT time is prolonged. If the oxidative time is really, really less, that means that antioxidant present in the system is very, very low. So by knowing this, what we did is we also measure in air how the oxidative inductive time is going to deplete over a range of temperatures. And then this is what, in case of a leachate, 55 degree and 70, and then this one 85 degree. And the moment I plot the YIT in terms of the logarithmic scale, then I can see this particular variation. So if the YIT is initially is this much, I know that the rate of depletion of the YIT and how much time is needed in order to touch the YIT equal to 0. That means that is the onset point where your membrane is subjected to the severe degradation. So basically, why we have done at various temperatures? Because if I am conducting a test at 25 degree, I may have to wait for my entire life in order to see the significant change. By increasing the temperature, what we did is we tried to see the accelerated aging, and by using a Arrhenius modeling, I can able to always back calculate what can happen at the 20 degree or to 10 degree. So this is the concept what we have used. Not only the YIT, the melt flow index, I told you molecular weight and crystallinity also we measured, and then we also measured the yield and then yield strength and break strength, and all these things were measured. And by taking all the things, we can able to back calculate the surface life. How do you back calculate? So in order to calculate the surface life, we use the 3-stage conceptual model proposed by the Grace Hahn of Drexel University. And what she proposed was a very simple concept. Your service life has 3 components. One is T1, T2, T3, something like your life, childhood, middle age, and then latter stage. Basically, the T1 is the time to deplete the antioxidants. Initially, antioxidants are significantly present in the significant portion is present in the G membrane, it depleted. But when the antioxidants in the G membrane become 0, that doesn't mean that G membrane immediately lost a mechanical property, or lost a diffusive property, or lost a melt flow index, or lost maybe the crystallinity. So what I mean to say is, if you are really looking at a parameter, if it is a tensile strength, you have one service life. If you have a crystallinity, you have another service life. With respect to the melt flow index, they have another service life. So you need to really see which is the critical path by which the membrane is going to lose its integrity. So after loss of T1, then there is an onset time. This is something like your 35 years old to the 55 years. You will not see any kind of degradation. Then after 55, you know that you will ramp down in its material property change. Same thing happens in human beings also. So by knowing all the things, what we can do is we can back calculate service life of a G membrane. These are some of the service lives what Professor Rowe and Reimer predicted. If a membrane is subjected to the 20 degree, some of the G membranes can long last even 1500 years. Sometimes you may be wondering that is it really true or maybe something really fluke. But actually, if you use a proper G membrane, a proper polymer, we can able to really delegate at least a couple of 100 years without any worry. And the same G membrane subject to 35 years, 35 degree, then the service life dropped down to 310. When the G membrane subject to the 50 degree, this is quite possible in case of a North American landfills, and then your service life gone down to 80 years. Now, can you be able to project it in case of India, where the groundwater temperature is in general 20-25 degree? If the oxygen, quite significant amount of the biological waste is present in your landfill, for sure your temperature may be subject to the 80-85 degree. If 80-85, your service life is only 30 to 35 years or maybe less than that. If you use a poor quality geomembrane, obviously you cannot really do anything. So based on this, what we have done is till now, we measure the service life. What we will do with the service life? Is that simply just we say that 80 years and then do we want to really take it forward? Of course, we take this one, the predicted service life, and to see how the contaminant impact is going to vary with respect to this one. We took again go back to the same liner. Maybe just for understanding point of view, I have considered a single liner system here, a geomembrane, a GCL, attenuation layer, and aquifer. By changing the service life of a geomembrane, how a model contaminant, something like an inorganic contaminant, something called a chlorine, a chloride, an organic contaminant which commonly present in the landfill is a benzene. How these contaminants are transported within the liner system if the membrane is aging over a period of time. In order to do this, how do you do that? We simply need one simple advective diffusive equation. At this particular partial differential equation, if you look at it, up to this point, if you look at it, is something similar to our one-dimensional consolidation equation. Dou u by dou t, a constant term, at dou square u by dou z square. There is no difference between the contaminant transport equation and then as well as your one-dimensional consolidation equation. Now, how best we can able to really predict the rate of change of contaminant with respect to time depends on how best we can able to really back calculate, measure the terms, the constants in this part of this one. So this is basically a diffusive term where D is the diffusion coefficient or the hydrodynamic dispersion coefficient, and where V is basically advective velocity, isopermeability, where K is basically retardation coefficient or the partition coefficient, where delta is basically degradation coefficient. Example, in case of organic contaminants, they degrade by themselves. There is a half-life based on this delta. Organic contaminants or radioactive decay, we can able to really see the decay term. So by measuring all these parameters and how these parameters are going to change with respect to the aging, and then can you able to really plug in once you measure that, and then by incorporating all these effects, what would be the contaminant impact at this site boundary within the aquifer? If you can able to measure it, then I think you are successful in quantifying the service life and then back calculating. In order to do this, now my next part of the presentation will dwell on how to measure these parameters. One is how to measure diffusion coefficient, how to measure the advective velocity, how to measure the partition coefficient, and then in case of a landfill, we may have to really worry about only in case of benzene, but in case of chloride, this becomes zero. This term will go off. So let us try to look at this one. The first term, what I'm really aiming is a K is a distribution coefficient or the partition coefficient. We commonly perform two varieties of tests. One is at batch sorption experiments or the column flow through experiments. In case of a batch sorption experiment, it's very, very simple. What you do is you take a bottle and you put some amount of the material of your interest, sorbent, either soil or the geomembrane or whatever it may be, and you fill with the contaminant of your interest, and then you keep on shaking for some time, allow the certain amount of the geomaterial or maybe the sorbent contaminant interaction time, and then at the end of the interaction time, the equilibrium time, you take out separate the sorbent and then the sorbate. Then what you do is you try to represent that particular amount of contaminant has been transferred from the liquid state to the solid state or the solid state to the gaseous state, whatever may be the case, and then you represent by using a theoretical sorption isotherms. Then this will able to really give you the sorption affinity of a contaminant in terms of the retardation coefficient or in terms of the sorption or the partition coefficient. So these parameters are going to vary, depends on the concentration of the contaminant, sometimes the sorbent type, pH value, temperature. Of course, when the moment you call isotherms is a constant temperature, and if it is a soil, the liquid solid ratio also going to change. So what we did is, in order to get the equilibrium interaction time, what time you need to really have? It depends on the type of the software nature of the material. Example, in case of a geometrical example, quarry test, you may able to really achieve the uniformity within a short period of time. Meaning thereby, you take a contaminant example 100 ppm in the solution, you put a soil in it or maybe the geomembrane in it, and then you try to see how the solution concentration is going to vary with respect to time. So over a period of time, what we have noticed is around 96 hours is really good enough. So remaining test, what we have done is we conducted by using a 96 hours of interaction time, and then at the end of the day, what you will have is initially you have a certain concentration in the leachate in the solution phase, and certain concentration at the end of the interaction time you have the CE. So the difference between the CA and CE is basically might have been transferred into the solid phase, and multiplied by the liquid solid ratio will give me the concentration in the solid phase. Once I know the concentration in the solid phase, once I know the equilibrium concentration in the liquid phase, if I try to correlate these two parameters linearly, it's called as a linear sorption isotherm, where you call it as a KD parameter. If it's a non-linear, we may say that it's a Freundlich isotherm. If it's something else, we may be able to really see a Langmuir isotherm. The selection of isotherm depends on the nature of interaction happens between the contaminant and then the sorbent. At the same time, it also depends on the surface characteristics of the material also to a certain extent. Anyway, that detail you need not really go through, but we want to really assess what kind of a contaminant, isotherm is really best suitable. This is one kind of a contaminant what we have really used in this case is, I think, one of the heavy metal in soil. So we try to represent in terms of the linear isotherm, Freundlich isotherm, and then Langmuir isotherm. By looking at the regression coefficient as well as the best fit parameters, we notice that the Freundlich isotherm is a good to represent the geometrical contaminant interaction, because this, since it is a soil. But in case of a geomembrane and an organic contaminant, maybe most of the times we may be very happy with the linear isotherm, or maybe most of, very seldom we may go to the Langmuir, but otherwise it is a one simple way. So, but the drawback with these gas sorption experiments is because they are not really, they are very simple, they are very easy to conduct. They may not represent the realistic contaminant and then the sorbent interaction very precisely. So the contaminant in migrate in the real life is as if it is something like a flowing of water through a column of a soil, so or a column of a liner. So in order to do that, column sorption experiments or the column flow through experiments are commonly conducted. But since the hydraulic conductivity is very, very low, sometimes these materials also having a very highest sorption, even though 1000 ppm is going in, most of the material is getting attenuated within the system. As a result, you may not get anything out of it. So as a result, you may have to really conduct the column experiments maybe for 5 to 6 years. It's very, very difficult. In order to avoid this particular problem, what we did is we try to accelerate the process, which is called by using a geotechnical centrifuge. We didn't really accelerate the sorption phenomena, but we accelerated the flow rate. We can able to accelerate the seepage velocity. We assume that even under the accelerated seepage velocity, the contaminant interaction time, the effect of the time is not really reflecting on the contaminant transport properties point of view. In view of this, what we did is a simple geotechnical centrifuge modeling. You might have seen this kind of a graph in the previous this one also. We can take a small model and subject it to the NG, and then effectively we can able to simulate the stress condition as same as the prototype, and then we did the same way. So for this purpose, what we did is we have a bucket, balanced beam centrifuge. I'm having a diameter of 2 meters at IIT Madras, and then this particular centrifuge we deployed. This is the centrifuge may look like this, and then this is a viewing window. There is another viewing window, and then internally, if you look at it, your bucket will look like this. So the bucket is having a size of something like 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter, where we have placed around 10 column flow through experiments, where the contaminant, this is the basically the liner material, where the contaminant is allowed to stagnate above, and then once it is really subjected to the accelerated environment, and this is collected in the effluent is being collected. Once you got the effluent, we normalize the effluent concentration versus the influent concentration, Ct by C naught versus time. If you look at it, this is called the breakthrough curve. Once you have the breakthrough curve, then you will get the retardation coefficient. You can also get to certain extent even diffusion coefficient also. So we also conducted both one in the 1G level. In order to enhance the hydraulic head, we placed the reservoir at the top around 2.5 meter above the ground surface, and then these are all simple column flow through experiments. If you look at it, the inlet from this tube I connected at the bottom, and then I allowed the contaminant to flow in the upward direction because we want to avoid any kind of a sidewall leakage and other thing. And then outlet is being collected by using a small tiny bottle here, and this water is, the effluent is analyzed for the concentration over a period of time. Example, if you look at it, in case of a 1G environment, the effluent concentration is normally the effluent concentration with respect to time. You please note that we have measured for the different varieties of, in case of a soil, but in case of a geomembrane, it's basically again we have measured for the organic contaminants. So at 1G, even after the 300 days, example in case of a chromium, the Ct by C naught is seldom reached very close to 0.1. In order to get any kind of a meaningful parameter from this kind of a breakthrough curve, you need to really project the value Ct by C naught, at least it should be able to reach 0.5. Can you imagine that how much time it will take in order to reach the 0.5? Maybe at least 4 to 5 years, cannot be less than that. So in view of this, what we did is, at the time, we know the CPS velocity, we know the time at which we have collected the sample, we converted the same data in terms of the pore volume. What is the meaning of pore volume? Pore volume is basically, the porosity of the system, the void volume of the sample, you know that how much quantity of water is being collected. If you normalize the water versus the number, volume of the pore volume of the void, then this becomes a pore volume. So because this is very much needed when you want to compare the breakthrough curves obtained from the 1G environment versus the 100G environment in the geotechnical centrifuge, then we got the same kind of a response. The moment we conduct the same test in a 100G, if you look at it, after 1 year, I reached only the 16 pore volumes of water only came out of the system. But in case of a centrifuge, I got around 150 pore volume. As a result, all my breakthroughs curves much above the 0.5, which is good enough for me to calculate this one. But even in centrifuge, if you notice that, how many hours I have conducted, almost something like a 17 to very close to 2000 hours. 2000 hours means you can calculate how many months. So we conducted this experiment continuously for more than 6 to 7 months in a geotechnical centrifuge. We didn't stop the centrifuge. Only just to collect the sample, we used to stop every 6-7 hours, and then we used to really run the system very well. So we got the breakthrough curves from the centrifuge test as well as 1G, because we cannot really 1G test, we cannot really wait for many years. So we want to really correlate the response of this one. We have also conducted the centrifuge test, what is the effect of G, and then we try to see how this value is really going to change. And then if I try to present in terms of the pore volume, and more or less I have the same kind of a response. So that means whether I conduct a test at 100G or 150G or 75G, my breakthrough curve is not really going to vary too much. That means that knowingly or unknowingly, we can able to really model the contaminant transport by using a geotechnical centrifuge. Because anyway, the desorption curve I don't really need at all, but only I am more interested in the desorption curve. So by using this data, what we can able to do is we can back calculate by fitting this theoretical curve, I can get the KD parameter. If I know the KD parameter, what I mean to say is, if I look at we have 3 KD parameters. One is, we got the KD parameter from the batch test, which is very, very simple. We also got the KD parameter from the centrifuge and this one. We correlated the KD parameter from the 1G test in the column flow through experiment versus a centrifuge. We noticed that these two are matching very well. And then what we did is, what are going to be the KD value we got it from the centrifuge, we took it as a real value, and then we try to normalize the batch versus this one, and then how it is really going to change with respect to the liquid solid ratio we noticed. By knowing this one, average KD ratio, then by fitting an experimental curve, what we got is we got an empirical equation by having a constant parameters A1, B1, B2, this one. And these A1, B2 is related to the almost 5 varieties of soils may represent from the broad range. Even one is a even quartz sand to the bentonite, two extreme case. And then we have taken the 5 varieties of contaminants, and then these values are really matching well. So as a result, what I want to really show you here is you conduct a batch option study, which is very simple. You don't need to really conduct a column flow through experiments, but by using this kind of empirical relationship, you get the KD ratio. That means that KD ratio is basically batch versus column for a given liquid solid ratio. Then you get a constant value. Once you have a constant value, you convert your batch option KD into column option KD. So that means that effectively what we are really trying to say is you need not to conduct a column flow through experiment, which is very time consuming. And then you try to conduct the experiment in a batch option. And then by using the methodology proposed by in this particular one, you use it and then you get the representative this one. If you look at the basic equation, one is a sorption term, second one is a diffusion term. In order to measure the diffusion, what we did is we have established this is a, during my master's and PhD time, we have fabricated this particular cell in the IIT Bombay. And then later on, because diffusion also is a very slow process. If you look at it, this much CT by C naught is a very long-term process. Example, if you are looking at a diffusion cell, it's having 3 components. One is a source reservoir, where the sample compartment, you have a receiving reservoir. You place a source reservoir at a certain concentration, and then you fill the receiving reservoir with a pure water. You have the chemical gradient of certain thing across the sample. This chemical gradient will push the molecules through the sample in a random walk way. And then if you try to monitor what is the concentration variation in this receiving reservoir, you normalize with the source reservoir, then you will have the CT by C naught versus time. Even if you are waiting up to even 10 to the power of -7, the CT by C naught is not really changing when you don't really, if you do the conventional test like this. But what we did is, we don't want to really wait this much time. In addition to the chemical flux, we also applied some amount of the electrical flux across the sample. And this is one of my master's students who did this. And then by applying the different voltages, we can able to pull the ion from one side to the other side in a very quick fashion. Now you may ask a question that, is that this particular setup, is it giving a diffusion coefficient? It's not going to be called as a diffusion coefficient, it's basically a percolation coefficient. Once you have a percolation coefficient, we can able to back calculate the diffusion coefficient. So that means that by applying the voltage, the same phenomena, I can able to really finish it in a short period of time. So that means that by using this particular modified cell, where chemical gradient is imposed, in addition to that, there is an electrical flux also being imposed against this one. We can monitor the thermocouples, the T-type thermocouple temperature of the both chambers. We maintain the leachate head more or less same, constant across the cell. That means that the hydraulic gradient is 0. That means the contaminant migrate from source reservoir A to the reservoir B only by the process called diffusion. Then by knowing this, we can able to really back calculate this one. Advective velocity from the same flow through, column flow through studies, we can measure the advective velocity. That means that we know the term diffusion from the diffusion test. We know the term K is a partition coefficient or distribution coefficient. People will use different terminology, depends on the type of the isotope what you use. And we know the decay coefficient of a given contaminant if it is an organic contaminant. And then by knowing all these parameters, mathematically, I can able to really back calculate what happens to the concentration of the chloride, what happens to the concentration of the benzene if the geomembrane surface life is varying anywhere between the 40 years to almost 730 years. Now you can see very clearly how the service life predictions what we made from by understanding the mechanisms of aging phenomena, then we transformed in terms of the contaminant impact point of view. So by using this study, you can able to really say that if there's any chance, if the geomembrane fails within 40 years of installation, that means that the peak concentration of either benzene and this one is both are really changing. So this is what exactly we have to really do that. Now we learn that geocentric liners are really good in safeguarding the geo environment. Can we able to dream of deploying these materials to contain at least not a high level radioactive waste, but at least low level radioactive waste and intermediate level radioactive waste by using a multi-barrier concept? Can we able to use it? I think we can, because now we have a good understanding of the polymeric science of a geomembranes and GCLs, and then how to really do that. So with the kind of a confidence what we have gained in this, maybe in a few minutes I will dwell upon some more projects where we have demonstrated the effectiveness of the geomembranes and GCLs, and how these materials are really performing well. So in addition to the GLS study what I did at the Queen's University, and then we have also constructed a research landfill around 40 kilometers away from the Kingston where we lived. And then this particular site is basically, you see, we have a basal area and this is the slope portion. On the other side of the embankment, we simulated a cover soil. So we have used almost 4 varieties of geomembranes. We have used 4 varieties of GCLs, and we didn't really place any kind of a waste in it. We operated this site for more than 11-12 years, and recently we dismantled again. We tried to construct it again, and this particular site is heavily instrumented. We have used more than 48, 36 TDRs, time domain reflectometers, to measure how the volumetric moisture content of the base is varying, so that how the GCL moisture uptake and retention properties are changing. We have also put good number of thermal sensors to capture how the geomembrane temperature is going to affect the formation of a wrinkle, and then how it's really going to age. So we have a sophisticated instrumentation tool here, and then you can see in the first slide, at this particular site, we did quite a lot of experiments, not only the performance of the geomembrane aging point of view, how the wrinkles of a geomembrane is going to be addressed. In order to address the geomembrane wrinkles, what we did is, we filled the balloon with a helium gas, and then this helium gas filled balloon, and we attached a camera here by using a remote control, and we let the balloon to go up almost 60 meters above that one, and then you can look at this 2 PhD students who did this work, and their images are taken from the 60 meters above, and then something look like a dot. But basically we captured the entire wrinkles by using a digital image analysis processing technique. We captured how the wrinkles are connected, how the wrinkles are, what is the impact of these wrinkles. So these are some of the images. It's myself, maybe in the summer 2007 or 8. I'm at the instrumentation tower, and this is a typical winter where our liner is completely covered. And then you can look at how the GCL is really going to happen. We rip the geomembrane and GCL at a regular interval of time in order to test some other properties. So based on this, we have shown that very clearly the liner is going to perform very well in the laboratory conditions in a very controlled fashion. We have also got some more inputs from the field data, and then we said that this liner is really good, provided if you use a proper liner material. Otherwise, it's going to be a bad. We cannot really say that based on this work, you cannot really say that all geomembranes are long lost for 80 years. If the membrane is not really made up of by using a proper composition and not a proper chemical properties, eventually your membrane may rip within 5 years. There is no doubt. You don't expect anything more than that. That means that while selecting a geomembrane or a GCL, polymer chemistry point of view, not the physical property, not the mechanical property, you have to really give high priority for the chemical properties. One is crystallinity, melt flow index, YT value. All these 3 parameters are stress crack resistance. These are the crucial parameters when compared to the tensile strength. Tensile strength comes out of the polymer matrix. Everybody use the same polyethylene, but only that 5% to 10% of the antioxidant package, that only decides the cost of the geomembrane and service life of the geomembrane, not the 90% of the backbone regime. Backbone regime, anybody can fabricate. So in addition to that, we also, and another few minutes, and then we deployed the same geomembrane and GCL at very harsh environment in the Arctic zone, where there are some fuel tanks were installed by the military due to their military operations. These tanks were leaking, and then as a result, the fuel went into the Arctic Ocean, and then we want to really prevent this. And then we have visited there during the 2007 summer, and myself and then along with the team, and we have only the frequent visitor, only the polar bear, no one else. So these guys, and then these are the oil tanks where you have the tanks in the plan view, and then the flume is really migrating in the downward direction. As a result, it met the coastal region, and then it's completely contaminating with this one. In order to prevent that, we have made a barrier just to contain the flume, so that we can come afterwards and then we can able to really do the remediation process. So this is a typical profile what we have used. We have used the geotextile as a protection layer at the bottom, and then in fact from the bottom, if you look at it, GCL and geomembrane, and then the geotextile, we covered it back. So this particular liner is embedded into the permafrost region, so that no contaminant can escape through the permafrost region. Only the soil above the permafrost region only is contributing for the contamination of the ocean. Then we contained it here, and now this particular liner is performing very well, even after installation of around 10 years now. So it's really good. And these are some of the pictures where we installed some of the geomembrane coupons. This is me and my doctor, and then he is a bear monitor to caution us that when the polar bear is approaching us or not. This is the geomembrane GCL samples I'm just sampling here. So with this, I came to the conclusion summary. We know that the efficacy of any engineering landfill primarily depends on the durability of the geomembrane liner. And the oxidation seems to be one of the major mechanisms. We have also developed a unique apparatus which is called as a GLLS, which is capable of simulating the liner aging by considering the combined effect of all possible mechanisms. We have also shown very clearly through this particular presentation, Freundlich-Thompson isotherm is a very good to represent the geometrical contaminant interaction, particularly for heavy metals. And we also demonstrate the accelerated physical modeling by using a geotechnical centrifuge to model the contaminant transport to get the sorption parameters very quickly in a short period of time. We also propose a generalized relationships to obtain the sorption parameters by simply conducting the batch sorption experiment, so that you can correlate it back, you can predict it back, what would be the sorption coefficient when you are really conducting through the column sorption experiments. Anyway, we propose the accelerated diffusion methodology to get the diffusion coefficient, and then finally we demonstrated very nicely that how to really predict the service life, and how the service life prediction is really impacting on the long-term performance, and then in terms of the contaminant impact point of view, by considering all synergetic, not only the environmental conditions, all degradation mechanisms also we have conducted. So with this, I wish to really thank, this is my research group, and then at IIT Madras, and then this is called Geo-Environmental Group, and then finally I wish to really acknowledge some of the pictures, some of the graphs I have taken from the, my collaborators, or maybe some of them directly from the textbooks. I wish to acknowledge them, and thank you very much for your patient listening. And then of course you may be knowing most of the stuff what I have discussed, but however I wish to really thank you all. So with this I'm done. I think we have 10 more minutes to go for the question and answers. The floor is open if you have any queries.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your very deliberative and informative, I will say more comprehensive also session with a complete profile, or I would say journey of the liners, particularly being how they are being tested, identified, placed, then further monitoring, and then how to also check the aging of these liners, and then its further application using centrifuge modeling. So really, sir, it was a very excellent and informative lecture today. We had an opportunity to listen to you. Now the participants are requested to have the question answers. Sir, one question just I wanted to ask. Is there any direct correlation means available with respect to the aging effect, what you did in your lab, and then you further have some field studies also. So with respect to particular type of waste or a particular type of liner, any such relationships are available?
Yes, I think we have conducted wide varieties of leachate composition also as a part of that study what I have shown earlier. The aging is to certain extent depends on the physical parameter like overburden loading, temperature, and chemical loading. There is no doubt. So what we have seen is the service life is really going to change the moment we change any one of these parameters. But in general, rather worrying about the composition change in the waste, what I would recommend is you focus more on the while selecting the material, their chemical properties, their interaction compatibility between the waste and then liner. That's really going to give you the long-term performance. So there are a lot of correlations, but because each and every composition we may not be able to test it in the laboratory, it is long-term testing. It's not a small, like around 3 to 4 years will go only. So instead, what we do is we recommend the chemical properties of the liner. If you take this one, even if the contaminant properties are varying drastically also, it's not a problem. Okay.
Means, for example, if I really want, because you told initially that the liners are mostly made up of the synthetic materials, and mostly they are based on chain reactions. So is it any possibility that if I infuse some particular type of what I mean to say chemical constituents which have a direct possible reaction with the waste which I want to use in our system, either to expedite the process or means what I mean to say to accelerate the process. Is there any such possibilities there, sir?
Example, now in case of manufacturing a geomembrane itself, we have wide significant improvements have been made. The best example is one is to tackle the antioxidant package and stabilizers what we use in the manufacturing process itself. Second thing is example, now diffusion of organic compounds through a geomembrane is quite inevitable. There is no doubt. In order to minimize the diffusion of the organic compounds, what people do is there is a certain process called as fluorination. Nowadays, to certain extent, we use the fluorinated geomembranes in order to tackle the issue. So what I mean to say is the change in chemical concentration to enhance the service, better improvement. Rather worrying about the composition of the waste, we try to modify the the manufacturing process of the geomembrane. Okay, that's the one thing. Second thing is there is another thing. Nowadays, people are making the multi-core geomembranes. Example, polyethylene may not be very good in addressing some of the aggressive contaminants. They do escape through the diffusion. Nowadays, we try to use the EVA material and then as a core, and then we try to put the geomembrane, the polyethylene covers on the top. Even the 1.5 mm thick geomembrane, maybe you may have a EVA core of around 500 micrometer, 0.5 mm thick. Then that really fantastically working as a diffusion barrier. So what I mean to say is the learning outcome out of the aging studies, rather addressing in terms of the chemical properties of the waste, people are addressing how to improvise the material property before installing in the field.
Okay. Sir, one of the parameter which you told is the temperature. Now, in the laboratory model, you had about means the temperature is controllable, or means we can control the temperature.
Right.
Okay, but now it's just a question I'm asking, that whenever any waste is being processed by any company, and when it is and when we are going for such projects with reference to liner, then there are many such reactions which we refer to as a post reactions, which really takes place with respect to once again age, or with respect to certain type of interaction that is taking place with respect to time, what I mean to say. But when we are using a constant temperature method in laboratory, it is sure that I am really what I mean to say, converting, or whether I'm 100% I'm using the waste for liners.
Yeah, you're right. I think. Can you see my this particular curve?
Yes.
Yeah. If you look at this particular curve, even though it looks like the service life only has been captured
The
here.
curve is not visible. Equation is visible.
Curve is not visible.
Yeah. Now visible, sir. Now visible.
Okay. Now, if you look at this particular one, this particular response of the material we captured not only considering the surface life of a membrane. In fact, we have incorporated the variation of temperature of the basal liner at the base of the liner over a period of time. So, because as you rightly mentioned, the temperature within the landfill is not constant. That is very much true. Even you need not to really worry about the change in waste type. In a given scenario, in a given landfill, even if the food waste is there or not, some of the readily degradable organics may undergo the degradation under the aerobic conditions. We all know that. Any aerobic condition in reaction, degradation, which is kicked off by the bacteria, is basically the respiration rates are very, very high. The degradation rates are very high. As a result, what really happens is not only the readily degradable waste will convert into these small compounds, the temperature at the base of the landfill also will keep on shooting up. Initially, imagine that if this is the groundwater temperature, it will maintain 20 degrees and slowly it will ramp up like a step function and then stay there for a long time, again come down. So that particular effect has been modeled in this particular graph in terms of diffusion coefficient, in terms of sorption coefficient. We have considered the effect of temperature also here. So nowadays, we can able to really capture the realistic variation of the temperature of a given landfill also in predicting the contaminant impact point of view, even in the service life point of view. In fact, at that particular graph I haven't shown here, there is a step function. Initially, first 10 years maintained constant, and from 10 years to the 30 years, there is a temperature is shooting up, and then thereafter it maintained constant again, it came down. Is that answered your question?
Hello. Yeah. Sir, what about the heavy metals which have already leached out? And let us say that if our liners has the capacity to retain those metals, okay, then further what exercise can be done to, I know there are many processes where people are being extracting these metals and other things.
I think we need to really understand one thing, that we are talking about the compacted clay liners here. We are not really talking about the geomembranes. Okay, when you are really coming back to the heavy metals, so the retention of heavy metals only happens in the either compacted clay liner or GCL. Okay. In general, the geomembrane will not have any ability to hold the or absorb any heavy metals. Geomembranes can able to take some amount of the organic compounds, but not. But when you are really coming back to the heavy metals, and the example now, imagine that in a given height of the landfill, a given composition of the waste, you know the mass of the contaminants present in the waste at the first place. And you know how much amount is leachable also out of the waste. Now, all these leachable heavy metals might have entered into the leachate over a period of time. Now, you need to really model now how the leached heavy metals entered into the cross the geomembrane through the holes or maybe through the defects, and then interacting with the GCL below or maybe the compacted clay below. Now, the compacted clay having a certain thickness. Now, imagine that it has a limited capacity to hold certain amount of the concentration. All right. Now, what people
Yes.
will do is, in order to limit the at the site boundary, this cannot be more than this particular contaminant cannot be more than certain value. Then what we in general we do is either we modify the liner material in such a fashion that, I mean, geomaterial what we choose for the compacted clay, either amend it with a certain type of amendments, kind of we will may add a highly sorbative kind of a material, or if it's a bentonite based and then we know we don't want to really re-engineer the material, what we can do is we can always increase the thickness of the liner in such a fashion that even at the end of the service life of your landfill, you may not cross the threshold value of given by the regulatory authorities. So that's why we always try to design the thickness of the liner required based on the magnitude, the amount of the contaminants to be solved, keeping in view of the capacity of the material to hold the contaminants. So these two things always, has to be considered when you're really, if at all you want to really minimize the contamination of the groundwater. Professor Shah, are you there?
I'm listening to you, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you for once again on behalf of Applied Mechanics Department. I am very much thankful to you, sir, that you accepted our invitation and had a wonderful lecture. Very informative and really very, I mean to say, it's a new vision which you have thrown on us, means you have developed and you have shared to us that such a means what is the real, because this was one of the question which was always in our mind, what regarding the aging of these liners and how this really been calculated. So it's a really very informative lecture, sir, you have given. So once again, sir, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shah. And then I wish to thank all the participants for their patient listening, even though somewhere I might have skipped unknowingly. Please excuse me for that. And then thanks a lot and have a good day. So with your permission, I will leave the meeting.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.